So we're going to turn to Carl Jung and his ideas on astrology and also on religion, because as you will see, they're closely related and they're very profound. So, Jungian astrology, which is often called psychological astrology, is the intersection of Carl Jung's analytical psychology and traditional astrological symbolism. Rather than using the birth chart to predict future events, this approach treats the natal chart as a symbolic map of the human psyche and a tool for self-actualization. Carl Jung famously called astrology the sum of all the psychological knowledge of antiquity. He frequently cast charts for his clients to gain a deeper perspective on difficult diagnoses. Now, what's going on here, we believe, is that each of the planets, each of the stars, have themselves sentient entities, archetypes of different sorts. And we're influenced by those as they move around. And the strength of their engagement with us varies with how close they are. And that leads to the whole notion of the power of astrology. So the implicit in this is we have a cause and effect relationship. The core principles of Jungian astrology are the following, that there's archetypes and there's planets. Jung proposed the human mind contains a collective unconscious. It's filled with universal inherited symbols called archetypes. In psychological astrology, the planets are viewed as these living inner archetypes rather than external forces that rule our lives. And that's how we get influenced. We resonate to a greater or lesser extent with these inner archetypes. So the sun represents the conscious ego, the core identity, and the purpose of life. The moon mirrors the personal unconscious, emotional habits, and the inner child or mother archetype. Mercury represents cognitive functions, communications, and the trickster or magician. Venus and Mars embody the inner feminine, the anima, and the inner masculine animus, dynamics of the psyche. Saturn represents the shadow archetype, psychological defense mechanisms, fear, boundary settings, and internal blocks. So Jung was always keen on synchronicity over causality. Jung rejected the idea that physical stars actively emit radiation that alters human behavior. Instead, he explained astrology through synchronicity, the concept of meaningful coincidences. Under the ancient Hermetic maxim, as above, so below, the movement of the planets and the human psychological events happen simultaneously because they reflect the same underlying cosmic patterns. That is, we resonate with one another. The birth chart is really a psychological map. Instead of viewing a birth chart as a fixed fate, Jungian astrology sees it as a blueprint for individuation, the lifelong process of integrating the conscious and unconscious mind to become your true self. There's harmonious aspects like trines that point to innate strengths and natural psychological resources. And then there's challenging aspects like squares that represent inner tensions, core complexes, and neuroses that serve as the exact catalyst needed for personal growth. So this suggests, looking at the trines and the squares, that it's really the configuration, the distances, and the nature of the resonances that can control everything. There's four elements and psychological types. Jung's theory of psychological types, which inspired the Myers-Briggs type indicator. That's these are what things do you prefer? Correlates directly with the four astrological elements. There's fire, which is Aries, Leo, and Sagittarius, matches the intuition function of gaining insight from possibilities. There's earth, which is Taurus, Virgo, and Capricorn, matches sensation function, processing physical facts via the senses. There's air, Gemini, Libra, Aquarius, which matches the thinking function, intellectual and objective evaluation. And then there's water, Cancer, Capricorn, and Pisces, matches the feeling function, the subjective evaluation based on values and emotions. So the real foundational pioneers in this, if you want to read further, there's Liz Green, who is a trained Jungian analyst who co-founded the Center for Psychological Astrology and wrote definitive texts like Saturn, A New Look at an Old Devil. There's Dane Rudhyar, a pioneer who reframed modern astrology and the mid-20th century from a fatalistic art into a humanistic psychological discipline. And then there's Alice Howell, author of Jungian Symbology in Astrology, Symbolism, which clearly demonstrates how planetary symbols map onto ego development. And here's examples of their books. You can find them all on Amazon. Now, let's turn to Jung's view on God. Jung essentially took the position the existence of a metaphysical God can neither be proven nor disproven by science or intellect. So, as a psychiatrist, he approached the question not as a theologian, but as an empirical scientist of the human psyche. He drew a sharp line between metaphysical reality, which he argued is beyond human knowledge, and psychological reality, which can be observed directly. So, this limits the knowledge. This leads to limits of knowledge, which is due to Kant, the so-called Kantian womb. Jung was heavily influenced by the philosopher Immanuel Kant, who argued that human beings are locked inside our own sensory and mental architecture. We cannot perceive the thing itself, das Ding an sich, which is German for thing itself. Because of this, Jung maintained that any attempt to prove a transcendent God exists outside of us, and that's an intellectual impossibility. Well, we have the God image in the psyche. While Jung said you cannot prove a metaphysical God, he asserted you absolutely can prove the existence of a God image, imago Dei, inside the human psyche. To Jung, the human mind possesses an innate universal blueprint, an archetype that produces divine, numinous, spiritually powerful experiences. Because these experiences have real observable effects on a person's behavior, mental health, and life direction, Jung considered the psychological reality of God to be a fact. Science can only establish the existence of an archetype, a God image in the psyche. You can never prove or disprove the existence of a metaphysical God. And this you can find in Jung's letters. So there's a very famous I Know interview. This is the nuance of Jung's position on God often gets confused because in 1959, the BBC interviewed Jung. John Freeman was the interviewer, and Freeman asked directly to Jung, did he believe in God? Jung paused and responded, I don't need to believe, I know. Now, this stopped Jung in his track. This stopped Freeman, the interviewer, in his tracks. Many people took this to mean Jung had concrete proof of a cosmic deity. However, Jung later wrote letters clarifying the statement. He explained he did not mean, I know a metaphysical God exists. He meant that he had been gripped by overwhelming objective psychological experiences of the archetypal God within the psyche. For Jung, experiencing the reality of the psyche bypassed the need for mere belief or intellectual proof. Now, Jung wrote one text on religion. He called it the Antwoord of Job, the answer to Job. He published it in 1952. It's his most controversial, raw, and intensely personal work out of everything that he wrote. He wrote it during a period of severe illness, and he described the book as being born from an internal frenzy that gave him no peace till it was all on paper. In it, Jung applies his psychological theories directly to the Judeo-Christian mythos, analyzing the transformation of the divine consciousness. He reads the biblical book of Job, not as a theologian seeking to justify God, but as a psychologist analyzing the relationship between God and humanity. So this different viewpoint, this different vantage point is critical. Jung argues in the Old Testament that Yahweh, or God, represents the totality of the unconscious psyche. He contains both supreme goodness and terrifying destructive darkness. Because Yahweh is omnipotent and completely unconscious of his own dual nature, he lacks self-reflection. So when Satan challenges Yahweh to test Job, Yahweh agrees, subjecting his most faithful moral servant, Job, to horrific suffering just to win a wager. Now, Job demonstrates moral superiority. The turning point here in all of this and of Western spiritual history, according to Jung, is that Job proves to be morally superior to God. Job is finite and suffering, but he maintains his moral integrity, and he sees through Yahweh's terrifying, contradictory nature. He recognizes that God is both a protector and a persecutor. Jung writes, Job realized God's inner antinomy, his self-contradiction, and in the light of this realization, his eyes are opened. Man's relationship to God is plagued by a profound dark side. So there's a need to incarnate here, because Job exposed this moral blind spot. Yahweh is forced into an act of self-reflection. To answer the moral challenge issued by a mere mortal, God must evolve. Now, this is truly mind-boggling. Jung posits that the entire New Testament, the incarnation of God, is Yeshua, the Nazarene, Jesus Christ. This is Yahweh's response to Job. God had to become a human because he had wronged humanity in the person of Job by becoming a vulnerable man, suffering unjustly and dying on the cross. My God, why hast thou forsaken me? What Yeshua said on the cross. God finally experiences what it actually feels like to be a victim of divine omnipotence. So we have the integration here of the shadow. For Jung, the story doesn't end with Christ, because Christ was entirely good, and the dark side of the archetype, the shadow, was left split off, which Jung argued explains the terrifying apocalyptic visions in the Book of Revelation. Jung concluded that the ultimate goal of psychological and spiritual evolution is individuation, the integration of the light and the dark, the yin and the yang. He saw the modern era as a time when the God image is incarnating, not as a single divine man, Christos, but into all of humanity. We're now tasked with carrying and integrating the tension of good and evil within our own psyches. Jung's interpretation of the book of Revelation in his answer to Job, when he looked at the apocalypse of John, is one of the most brilliant and unsettling applications of his theory of the psychological shadow. Jung did not view Revelation as a literal blueprint for the end of the world, nor as a simple political allegory about the Roman Empire. Instead, he read it as a massive, unconscious, psychological compensation occurring within the mind of its author, John of Patmos. So here's how Jung broke down the psychology of the apocalypse. Jung famously identified the author of the Revelation with John the Apostle, the same John associated with the Gospel and the epistles that preach absolute love, light, and brotherhood. God is love. From a Jungian perspective, preaching only love and perfection creates a massive psychological imbalance. The human psyche naturally contains both light and dark, good and aggressive impulses. If you forcefully repress the dark side to be perfectly holy, that energy doesn't just vanish, it sinks into the unconscious, bloats, and turns toxic. Jung argued that the terrifying blood-soaked visions of Revelation were the sudden violent eruption of John's repressed shadow. After a lifetime of forced, suffocating sweetness, John's unconscious mind retaliated with a fantasy of ultimate cosmic destruction. Because John was tapped into the collective unconscious, his personal psychological explosion mirrored a shift in the collective God image. In the Gospels, God is presented as a loving, merciful Father, entirely split off from evil. But Jung argued that the unconscious totality of God cannot be suppressed forever. In Revelation, the divine shadow breaks through with a vengeance. The Lamb turns into a monster. Christos, who was a gentle, self-sacrificing Lamb of God, in the Gospels, returns as a wrathful warrior, breathing fire, opening plagues, and treading the winepress of God's fury until blood flows as high as a horse's bridle. The Antichrist is born. Jung noted that the birth of the perfect all-good Christ logically required the eventual constellating of a psychological opposite, the anti-Christ. The universe demands balance. The apocalypse is a boundary stone between world epochs. It shows what happens when the dark side of God, which was omitted from the Christ image, breaks through into human consciousness. So, despite the horrors of plagues and beasts, Jung pointed out the climax of Revelation is actually a profound symbol of psychological wholeness, the heavenly Jerusalem and the wedding of the Lamb. In Jungian psychology, this conjunctio, the sacred marriage in alchemy, it represents the ultimate integration of opposites, the conscious mind and the unconscious, the masculine and the feminine, the light and the dark. The woman who's clothed with the sun, this is the anima or divine feminine, is being elevated into the heavenly realm to balance the purely patriarchal trinity. The New Jerusalem, a perfect square or a mandala, which is the ultimate archetype of order, wholeness, and fully integrated self. So Jung concluded the revelation was an early warning system for humanity, showed if we attempt to build a civilization or a religion based only on absolute perfection while ignoring our capacity for evil, that evil will eventually project outward as collective madness. So for Jung, the modern age of global warfare and mass destruction is the literal enactment of revelation, not because God is angry, but because humanity has failed to recognize and integrate its own dark shadow. Jung's critique of the Christian Trinity is one of the most profound structural arguments. He used the concept of the quaternity, a symbol of fourfold symmetry, not three, to argue that the Trinity is psychologically incomplete. To Jung, the number three represents a dynamic developmental process, like a thesis, antithesis, and synthesis, but it's inherently unstable because it lacks a grounding foundation. The number four, by contrast, represents static wholeness, completion, and ultimate structural stability. By framing God as a Trinity, Father, Son, and Holy Spirit, Jung argued that Western consciousness had structurally excluded two vital dimensions of reality: evil, which is the shadow, and the feminine, which is matter and the anima. So Jung observed that um, across almost all ancient cultures, mythologies, and alchemical traditions, the quaternity emerges as the primary architect of the fully realized self. We see it in the four directions, the four elements, the four seasons, and Jung's own four psychological functions: thinking, feeling, sensing, and intuition. When a system stops at three, remains uprooted in the realm of the ideal, spiritual, and abstract. To bring that system down to earth, make it whole, fourth element must be added. So Jung's primary psychological critique of the Trinity was that it is an image of absolute perfection, leaves no room for absolute imperfection. Mainstream Christian theology, evil is often defined as provatio boni, merely the absence of good, rather than a real, substantial force. And Jung fiercely rejected this view. He argued that evil is a tangible, potent reality. By omitting evil from the divine schema, the Trinity splits the cosmic psyche in half. So Jung suggested that from a structural standpoint, the devil is the missing fourth element, turns the Trinity into quaternity. The Trinity, which is pure light, the devil, which is pure darkness, and leads to the quaternity, which is wholeness. By acknowledging the devil as the fourth, the psyche stops projecting evil outward and instead recognizes that light and dark are bound together in a structural tension. So Jung noted the missing fourth wasn't always interpreted as the devil. In other psychological contexts, the Trinity is incomplete because it's entirely patriarchal and spiritual, completely ignoring the feminine and the physical world of matter. He watched the Catholic Church closely, was deeply fascinated when Pope Pius XII declared the dogma of the Assumption of Mary in 1950, asserting that Mary was taken physically, bodily, into heaven. So while Protestants and secular critics mocked this decision, Jung praised it as a monumental psychological event. By bringing a human woman bodily into the heavenly realm, the divine image shifted from a purely masculine trinity to a balanced quaternity. The feminine or anima and the physical universe, matter or mater, We're finally integrated into the divine blueprint, and the transition from the Trinity to the Quaternity is a process of bringing the lower world of matter, the feminine and the shadow, into the realm of spiritual consciousness. For Jung, sticking rigidly to the Trinity forces humans to strive for an impossible one-sided perfection. This inevitably causes us to repress our own dark impulses, which then project onto others as hatred and division. Shifting our internal archetype to the Quaternity demands we strive instead for wholeness. Wholeness does not mean being perfectly good. It means having the courage to look into our own depths, acknowledge our own inner shadow, and hold the agonizing tension of our contradictions until a higher integrated consciousness is born. So there you have it. Let's see where things go.